control the French power in North America, at least for a considerable length of time. However, the war was expensive, and the war managed to almost wreck the British economy. By one estimate, the British had accumulated a war debt of 122 million pounds. Now, in the colonists did face colonial taxes, but these were fairly low. The colonists also had taxes that they had to pay to the British Crown. And of course, the residents of England did too. Now, in jolly old England, the colonists paid, the English residents paid 26 times as much as the colonists did to the British Crown. For instance, in England in 1763, the average resident paid 26 shillings in taxes each year. In the colonists, in Massachusetts, the most rebellious of the colonies, the Massachusetts residents in 1763, 1 shilling to the British Crown. Well, what did I hear led to the Revolutionary War? Here's what I was told. The question basically was, who's going to pay for that war? That expensive war that dragged on for 7 years. And the colonists didn't want to pay for the war. The British, though, I was told the colonists, you benefited from that war, now it's your turn to pay the piper. And also the British reminded the colonists that they had ousted the French, had them out of the way, and they had driven the Indians westward. The Indians that occasionally would attack the colonists. Another thing that I was told led to the war was the fact that the British and the colonists were kind of becoming two different people. And many of the colonists were starting to think of themselves as Americans, as more than British. The countries had a different situation. In England, it was difficult for a poor person to have ever owned land. A poor person was somewhat set for life in poverty. By contrast, in the colonies, if a poor person had a little boldness, hard work, a little effort, and maybe a little luck, a person in the colonies could eventually own land, and there was land available, a big land that was available where they could own their own land and make a good living. Something else that irritated the colonists was called the Proclamation of 1763. This Proclamation of 1763 preserved the land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River for the Indians. And the British said, according to this Proclamation of 1763, that maybe this would ease the problems that the colonists were having with the Indians. It would put the Indians in one location where there wouldn't be any problems for the colonists, for their British colonists. It also would manage to keep the colonists bottled up on the Atlantic coast where they could keep and maintain this mercantile system. But the colonists, who also were banned from moving into the Indian land, Britain would not allow them to trade in the Indian land. The colonists didn't like the system. And where are we sitting today? Well, we're right on that Indian land, right here. However, the colonists wanted to push westward, and they complained to the British, and especially the colonial land speculators who were hoping to buy and sell some of that land in the far west here and make money. But eventually the British heard the objections, and they eased the restrictions somewhat, softened some of the rules. Also, the British wanted to protect the colonists. They realized the colonists were a little vulnerable, and they wanted to protect the colonists, and the British decided after the French and Indian War to station some British troops in the colonies. But the colonists didn't always enjoy having those British soldiers around, and eventually they began to resent them more and more, and that maybe that helped to lead to the Revolutionary War. In Britain, I was told that the British really didn't have a lot of heart for fighting the colonists. The colonists were British, they were their British brothers, and they felt funny about battling the colonists in a war. The colonists had a champion in Parliament. His name was the statesman Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke favored a very conciliatory, easy policy with the colonies and didn't want the British to really crack down on the colonists. But Edmund Burke's view did not prevail. Edmund Burke's view was probably the opinion of maybe 1/3 of the British people, but the prevailing view was that of King George III. And King George had his own problems occasionally with mental health and mental illness, but King George really was no tyrant, but he realized somehow he was going to have to raise some taxes to pay for this war that occurred. And he realized the colonists were going to have to be involved in paying off some of this war debt. And for the colonists, they had a cry that went forth, "No taxation without representation." Well, I was told that was pure propaganda. The colonists didn't want a representative in Parliament. He'd be easily outnumbered by the British interest, and he wouldn't have much power. Mainly, the colonists didn't want to pay the taxes. That's what I heard. But the taxes did come. I think there were probably about 4 main taxes and actions that were taken by Parliament. The first one was the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act put a tax on molasses that were imported from the West Indies and from Africa. The colonists objected to the Sugar Act. The British Parliament heard them, and the tax that had been set was eventually reduced by 2/3, but the tax remained, but it was cut a lot. The next year, the Stamp Act occurred. And under the Stamp Act, the British put a tax on every time a document was produced, it had to have that British stamp on it. So these documents would include wills, deeds, newspapers, even playing cards. And somehow, I was told, they even put a tax on dice, a Stamp Act tax. But the colonists objected, and the next year the British said, "No more Stamp Act, it's repealed." But then, a man named Charles Townshend became the Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, and that made Charles Townshend the chief taxman in Britain. And he said the reason that the colonists didn't like the Stamp Act is that whenever they were getting their newspaper or whenever they were getting a document, it was forcing them to individually pay that tax, and they realized it. So Townshend said, "I have a way that will keep them happy and will make money for the crown. And the way is that we will tax these goods coming in at the ports, and then maybe the fee for the tax will just be passed on in the finished product. We're going to tax paper, lead, paint, and tea." The colonists objected to the Townshend Acts. 3 years later, the British removed the taxes from all of them except tea. Colonists didn't like that. In 1770, a mob formed in Boston, Massachusetts, and the mob began throwing snowballs at the British soldiers. Then they progressed from snowballs to rocks and stones, and the mob even had clubs. The soldiers lost their cool. The British soldiers turned on the crowd and shot into the crowd. 5 colonists dead, 6 wounded. The colonists were enraged. The British regretted what had happened and how that their soldiers had fired on their own citizens and killed 5 of them. And the colonists complained about this greatly, and it became known as the Boston Massacre. Whenever I hear that word massacre, to me it sounds almost as if hundreds might have died. Well, it certainly was bad that 5 died, but in England we thought massacre was quite an exaggerated word to describe this terrible shooting. 3 years later, the British tea still had its tax, And the British tea was of superior quality to the other tea that some of the colonists were drinking. That was from the Dutch. British tea was better, and even with that British tax on there, that tea was less expensive than the inferior Dutch tea. The colonists, the rebel leaders, began to be afraid that the colonists would be buying this better British tea for less money, and that it would undermine their arguments for no taxation. So, a band of rebels dressed up as Mohawk Indians, and they boarded the ships that contained the tea in Boston Harbor. They dumped 342 cases of tea into Boston Harbor, and that became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain wouldn't let an incident like that go unnoticed or unpunished. And so the next year, Britain passed the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts. And these acts closed the port of Boston for commerce. And it was intended to really bring those Bostonians to their knees. At the same time, the British decided that a tougher individual was needed to become governor of Massachusetts, and they turned to British General Thomas Gage. Gage demanded that Boston and Massachusetts pay for the British tea, but Boston and Massachusetts refused to pay for the tea and refused to express the regrets over the Boston Tea Party. Then Thomas Gage said, the Massachusetts is in revolt, and the British decided to crack down even more. A few months later, the British learned that the colonists had been accumulating arms, weapons, and military supplies at Concord, Massachusetts. And Gage was ordered to send 700 British troops to Concord to confiscate these weapons, capture them, and destroy the weapons that the colonists had accumulated. The colonists found out what was going to happen. Paul Revere made his famous ride. Boom! The Revolutionary War had begun there in the Boston area. The next year, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Well, Thomas Jefferson was responsible mainly for writing the Declaration of Independence. Where did he get his basic ideas that appear in the Declaration of Independence? Well, those came from British philosopher John Locke. So the ideas of Locke were somewhat turned on us British. Well, why did the British lose the war? First, the war was a distant war. It's hard to fight a war 3,600 miles from your shores. And that was certainly a complicating factor. Also, the colonists were rather disorganized. They didn't have a colonial capital, and that worked against them. But it also worked against the British. It also meant that there was no one city that the British could invade, capture that city, and perhaps quickly turn the war in the favor of the British and end the war. And so the spread out area of the colonies worked against the British. Also, the British at times would concentrate on George Washington's army, but maybe not enough. And then when they would decide to capture the army, suddenly the army was pretty evasive and elusive and would make some tactical retreats. And George Washington's army, maybe not well supplied, but it was difficult for the British to control and always remained a problem. Also, the British had always decided that if anything like a war would break out, that the British would have lots of friends in the colony, these loyalists. But it didn't work out that way. The loyalist support was there a little, but it was highly disappointing to the British. So many of the residents of the colonies swung over to the colonial side. And the colonials used lots of intimidation to keep the loyalists under control. These are major problems, but still, despite all these problems, I was told that the British probably would have gone ahead and won the war. But there was one additional problem that turned the war, and that is that after the colonial success at the Battle of Saratoga, the French recognized the British colonists and recognized them as a country, the United States of America, and then the French provided supplies, manpower, military trainers, and especially that French fleet that proved decisive at the Battle of Yorktown, the final battle final major battle in the Revolutionary War. In the colonies, there are individuals who are considered heroes of the American Revolution. And I'd like to tell you what I heard about some of these heroes. John Hancock, the American hero, John Hancock, not to the British. To us, I was told John Hancock was a rich and vain individual. We considered him, our favorite term to describe John Hancock was an elegant revolutionist. He was a member of the governing class of merchants and landowners, and John Hancock felt that his interest, his personal interest, his financial interest, his pocketbook was threatened by some of the policies of the British. John Hancock also had his eyes on those western lands, and when the British cut off the western lands from John Hancock, he didn't like it, and he quickly became a revolutionary. Another one was Samuel Adams, another person in Boston. Samuel Adams was chiefly responsible for the Boston Tea Party. In Britain, I was told that he was a tough and conniving professional politician. And Sam Adams was said to control two mobs that he would use to further his personal gain, to make more money for him and to increase his political power. George Washington. Well, we British don't really have much, I was told that we British didn't have much complaint against George Washington. He was well respected. We do remember, though, that George Washington learned a lot of this farmer, George Washington, learned a lot of his military tactics in the French and Indian War. He was Colonel Washington then, and he was working for the colonials and for the British side and fighting in the French and Indian War. And he used many of the tactics and techniques he learned in the French and Indian War, he turned on the British and used against the British in the Revolutionary War. Well, those are some of the people from the olden times of how they were seen by the British. But now I might present the British side of a very notorious group here in the United States. This is the Ohio Valley chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. And in this Ohio Valley chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, we think of Ernie Payne, who documents a lot of the actions that this rebel group, these descendants of these rebels, take. We have the ringleader of the Ohio Valley chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, John West. We have Dr. Mark Browning, who documents a lot of the things that go on, and he dresses in colonial clothing and the clothing of the rebels. We have Kenneth Gilkey. He provides the evidence that proves the guilt of these these descendants of these Revolutionary War soldiers, and it's hard to deny it once Ken Gilkey gets hold of you and starts digging up these documents. Then we have Don Counts. He travels all over the state of Indiana telling about the sons of the American Revolution, and he likes to dress up and tell all about his country, America. Then we have Nicholas Dukes. He's an example of one of the newer members of the group. But he's embraced a lot of the ideals of the Sons of the American Revolution against the wonderful British Crown. Then we have Michael Flake. He's another one of the young members, and he likes to tell about the Sons of the American Revolution, and he is always has a computer near at hand to make sure that the Sons of the American Revolution and their stories well told. Then we have Chris Myers. Chris was known at one time for putting out a publication that told all the glorious things that the Sons of the American Revolution, the descendants of these rebels, did. Well, that's about all I wanted to let you know about. But I want you to know that you can never say that Roe on Roe didn't tell you the other side of the American Revolution. Thank you.
In 1976, and I was lucky enough to get a whole case of these unopened. And so this is a pristine book that I'd like to present to you for speaking for us today.
Thank you.
Even though you are from wherever that place is, across the little river there. What is it called?
The bond.